So let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that comes up in Reinhold Seeberg's book, a textbook of the history of doctrines, this was published in the late 19th century and translated into English in 1905, is he raises this point when he deals with the method and history of doctrines. And I'll read this quote for you. "The history of doctrines, being a historical science, must employ the strictly historical method. What really occurred and how it came to pass must be impartially related upon the basis of original sources critically examined. This requirement is met by tracing the effective forces in their origin and influence, as well as the interpenetration and cooperation of the various forces. Only thus is it possible to set forth truthfully how it really was. In doing this, we must presume upon a general knowledge of the history of religion, of the church, and of philosophy, as well as some practice and facility in the sphere of historical criticism and objectivity. Every age, furthermore, will preserve its own version of the history of doctrines, since our conception of the past is always conditioned by the views, problems, and questions of the present age." That's a very helpful quote on some of the issues that face a historian as well as a theologian whenever you engage the history of the church. The first one I'd point out is those dastardly things called origin and influence. That is extremely difficult to pin down in some cases when you deal with terms and concepts and ideas. And what this points us to is the way forward is through a comparative method. It's deep reading, and it's simply also an awareness, as it's pointed out here, the history of religion, the church, and philosophy. It also, I would add here, it points out that this is a conversation within a community. You cannot do this in isolation, or at least you cannot do it well in isolation. And it's realizing that with as much objectivity as you can, our views of certain things in the history are conditioned by views, problems, and questions of the present age. And so it's helpful to be circumspect not only in our own assumptions, but also helpful to dive into the issues and terms and concepts of the day. So this is a basic point in research methodology. I think most graduate students would be familiar with this and would agree in some measure to this sort of point. But I'd also go further that he's helpful also in this. He says further on in this same section, "The original sources of the history of doctrines are, besides the respective resolutions, decrees, bulls, and confessions, the records of the transactions of the bodies by which these were promulgated." And then I've emphasized, obviously, this point, also the writings of the theologians who participated positively or negatively, directly or indirectly in the origination of the respective doctrinal systems. It's that last one, indirectly, that's difficult to pin down. Frequently we run across comparative studies in theology where someone looks at Augustine, Thomas, Calvin, and Barth. And skipping over those centuries without an awareness of the context and the changes and the terms creates all of its own problems as well, even though it might simply try to do a comparison within that body of literature. It's not to say that the comparison can't be done, but it is to say that as a historical enterprise, it must be done very carefully with sensitivity to the documents themselves. And then finally, he points out that documents attesting the faith of the church, such as sermons, hymns, and liturgies, and the literature of church discipline must be studied. What I appreciate in this method that's been mentioned here in this history of doctrines is not only the rootedness in the sources, that's the ad fontes part, but also the point that these are conversations. And it impacts a certain piety within the communities where these views are propounded, whether in churches or sermons, hymns, liturgies, literature of church discipline. And I would add, let's go one more, the academic context of the early modern university. I think if we're going to do a good study of early modern theology, we need to be in the context of early modern universities, which is a different form of discourse than what you would have in a sermon. So we have to attend to genres, we have to attend to distinctions, we have to attend to definitions. I think all of these things are pretty straightforward in one sense in our method. And so some of the questions that we have to deal with in these problems are two in one sense. Where does a term originate? Is it an innovative term, something that is now summarizing a concept that has been present for a long time? Is it a direct quotation or usage from another writer or author? Do we have direct influence? I think of, for example, the relationship in my own work between Marcius and de Moor at the University of Leiden. De Moor is self-consciously seeking to outline and expound to Marcius's theology as it was transmitted to him as his professor to the student. And so we can say there's a direct influence between Marcius and de Moor. But in Marcius, Johannes a Mark, was a professor at Leiden of theology in the late 17th century.
M-A-R-C-K-E?
M-A-R-C-K-I-U-S. Sometimes Johannes van der Mark, sometimes Johannes a Mark, sometimes Johannes Marcius, and then Bernardinus de Moor. Both of these were professors of theology at Leiden, and their respective careers get you from about 1670 through about 1775. So between those two gentlemen, it represents about 100 years of theology at Leiden. And so you can speak in that context of a direct influence. But you would also have to speak of an indirect influence. Who are the people that Marcius is reading and engaging both as positively and negatively? And I think that becomes a trickier game unless he's explicitly citing someone. And then here's another one that always vexes theologians and historians alike. What counts as influence? And how that comes to us. Did someone read Thomas Aquinas directly? Did they read them through other authors of their own day? Were they appropriating a previous engagement? How exactly does someone from a prior age influence someone in a current one? And then finally, what is that history of the transmission? All of these things are bound up in that question. And so I think the path forward as a historical method is, as we saw in Seeberg, and has been modeled elsewhere. I mean, I think of many other historical theologians today that model this. But I think part of the solution is, of course, a critical engagement with the writings of a particular person or church or confession or controversy, and they require an engagement with concepts and terms. I'm frequently asked by students in THM programs and seminary, where do I go to orient myself to the context of this early modern period for theology and philosophy? What one text, I think that's the question. They want a silver bullet that answers all of the problems. And I don't think there is one. Part of the answer is simply pick up and read, and you get into that hermeneutical spiral of engagement with the text and your context and the text and the context, and also your present questions and the past questions. I think that's part of the starting point. But we need to focus in on the concepts and terms, and this is the tricky part, as they were familiar with them. And there is the difficulty. What can we use as historians of doctrine and as church historians to delve into this period in a fruitful and respectful way that really honors the words as they would recognize them, and the terms and the concepts? This requires not only familiarity with the proximate subject of investigation, but also trajectories of terms and concepts. I'll give you an example, and this is a shameless book plug, but this is probably the only Ferrari I will ever own. This is a book called A Lexicon of St. Thomas Aquinas by Roy J. de Ferrari. But this is a nice textbook, and it's basically cross-referenced to the corpus of Thomas Aquinas, and it works through all the different terms and these sorts of things. I'll give you an example. If you looked up the word ratio in a standard classical dictionary, one of the things you would find out is you'd get maybe a paragraph or two on the word, maybe 3 or 4 different definitions. If you look it up in here, you will get 4 or 5 pages cross-referenced with various kinds of reason. Ratio, account, reckoning, and et cetera, et cetera. And the point is made very well with that type of lexical engagement. A very specific body of literature requires a very specific tool. So something like this lexicon of St. Thomas Aquinas helps us get into the thought and modes of thought for someone like Thomas Aquinas. Well, we should be doing something similar for persons of the early modern period. This, as you can imagine, would take quite a while to organize. It's the work of scriptoria of sorts. in terms of engagement. But this idea that we need a simple return to the sources is, in some sense, too simplistic. The assumption is that just a return to the sources will get us everything we need to know. No, it won't. You need to return to the sources with a sensitivity to the terms and concepts in the sources. So it's not simply just a return to the sources. We have to understand them within their own terms. And there's actually tools available to us from the period. So it's more than a simple return to the sources. Of course we read the documents critically, but we need to recover the structures of thought, the concepts, and the modes of thoughts in order to do it well. So I think part of this solution is a cycle of engagement with primary sources, and then one step further, common textbooks and reference works from the period. For translators, I would encourage you to look at, if you're translating a piece from the 17th century, try to find a dictionary from the 17th century, especially if you're translating a Dutch writer. You can find Dutch-Latin dictionaries from the 17th century that are specific to a particular theological or philosophical context. Those types of works are very helpful in understanding perhaps a circle of meaning. Now, of course, that has to be checked. Of course, it has to be demonstrated that this is exactly what they mean. But it's helpful to think outside of the box of, I'll just go pick up Oxford Latin Dictionary and open up a 17th century text and assume these things are the same. We have to move a little more nimbly. So I'd like to give you some examples. What you see behind me is some examples of theological and philosophical handbooks from the period. These are teaching aids within the period that were used. I think most people, if I said Philip Melanchthon's Loci Communes, people would be familiar with that. But what they may not be familiar with, and which, as far as I'm aware, has not been translated, is some of his books like this, Definitiones, where it's definitions of the many of the terms which are commonly or traditionally used in the church. So here's a little work on definitions in Philip Melanchthon. There's also the works of Distinctiones. And these are these handbooks not only of definitions, but if this is the definition, then a distinctio is here are the terms that are in play. And these are not simply just a question of, this sort of engagement of definitio and distinctio is what an early modern student, when they enter the university, would have been handed. Whether you're in a Lutheran environment, whether you're in a Reformed environment, whether you're in a Catholic environment, these books that give you kind of an orienting sort of vocabulary into the day are very helpful. Now, as you read through the prefaces of these works, one of the things you'll find, like in Melanchthon, is he'll tell you that these are the types of terms that are used in the types of questions we're interested in. So he's giving you the tools necessary to follow the argument. And I think it's an interesting point that whenever you don't have these sorts of things attended to in the scholarship, we can bring all sorts of our own baggage into the equation when we're not attending to it. So this sort of approach was very common. This particular work was present and went through many publications. This particular edition is from 1554. Then you get into some other examples. The one on the left, this one is by, I've got to see if I can get his name correct. His name is Henri Louis Chastanier de la Roche-Posay. And this particular work, let me see if I can move around here. A Mac guy on a non-Mac guy on a Mac is an interesting thing. All right, let's see. Yes, some of these, I've arrived at most of these, if not all of them, through using PRDL. This particular gentleman, one of the points that you notice is he's trying to engage if you notice in the second line here, primavis ac recentioribus philosophies. He's dealing with not only previous and ancient philosophers, but more recent ones. And this is a Catholic work that's trying to work through a variety of the issues and problems that are showing up in their engagement with Protestants. And so you've got these a catalog of all the authors that he's going to use. So they give that to you up front, telling you what years they lived in. So this is a reference tool, again, for students to know, here's Alexander of Hales, Bonaventure, all sorts of folks. And then as you work through this, just as this should encourage the heart of any Reformed Ramist. This is a Roman Catholic who this whole philosophical distinction book is French brackets. The whole thing is based on is just page after page of how these things break out. So the way the distinctions are made in the mid-17th century, he's dealing with these sorts of terms. This is a fascinating little study in its own right about the way you work through different types of issues. But what's helpful here is it shows you, as you work through the piece in a very visual way, the linkage between the terms, where they're distant, where they're in agreement, where they're in difference, what the sorts of contrasts are. It's very helpful as this works through. For example, here's all the different ways you can discuss act, whether it's pure or independent, whether it's absolute, whether it's relative, whether it's metaphysical, physical, formal, etc., etc., etc. So this all of a sudden gets you into the ground in which most of these men lived and worked. Now, moving back to definitiones. This one, Definitiones and Distinctio, this work has actually been published, translated. You can find this in print. It might be more difficult to find in print, but you can find this. This is, of course, Maccovius, who was a Reformed theologian at Franeker, perhaps known as one of the few theologians that was actually tried at the Canons of Dort and rebuked, although cleared, for using too difficult of a style in some ways. But one of the things you find through here is, notice he's giving students the distinctions and also the theological and philosophical rules. That's an important point. He's giving here the distinctions that are being made, the rule, and now also the guidelines about how you do the discipline. So these sorts of books in an academic context are very helpful whenever you begin to read and interpret a particular writer. This one I thought was particularly fun. This is a German Lutheran piece where the distinctions and philosophical terms that are frequently used in theology, this is by Hockman. I thought it was interesting, given I've recently had to chuckle at a presentation I heard about excising Thomism from Reformed theology, root and branch, and at the same time, the gentleman kept on using the phrase fundamentum in re, fundamentum in re, fundamentum in re, invoking Thomistic language in the very conversation he's talking about, trying to excise it, root and branch, from theology. And this is a distinction here, if you'll notice, the a se ipso, the very first phrase in this definition and distinction book, is on the issue of aseity. In this very particular Lutheran construction, we have two senses in which you should understand the word a se ipso. This is helpful, as when you begin to look at what was a Lutheran student being taught, what was a Reformed student being taught on the distinction and how it should be maintained. And what's nice about some of these older reference books is, notice here, he's showing you, this is in Gerhard, you can see it in sections on Thomas, you can see it in Nicholas Arnoldi, where he's dealing with, and notice the distinction is coming up in a conversation with the Socinians. So if you're going to attend to the question of aseity and the doctrine of Christ in the early modern period, and you're going to look at Turretin or Vutzius or de Moor or whoever else on this sort of issue, look at who the conversation is with. Even among the Lutherans and the Reformed, it's with primarily the Socinians. And so the direction here that you see from the document is that you can look at it from confessional distinctions, you can look at it from academic perspectives, and you can look at it across a variety of sources. This is where this is invaluable. It's helpful for our work as scholars and students. Another one that I would give you, this is Reeb. This is a Jesuit. This is a 19th century edition of a of another 17th century, 18th century work, I believe. And so one of the things that you get here is, again, it's a treasury of philosophers, or distinctions in philosophical distinctions and axioms. So again, it's laying out, here's how they understand certain questions among the Jesuits. These sorts of, and this is a multi-volume work, by the way, these sorts of handbooks are, again, invaluable for working through the terms and examples given. So part 1, philosophical distinctions, and you get in immediately into the ways and the multiple senses of explanation and the proposition of the truth. So one of the things that's happening here is not only are they teaching basic philosophy, not only are they teaching basic theology, but they're also cross-referencing into other environments. I think this is a very helpful way for working through all sorts of differences. This next person is Etienne Chauvin. This is a Reformed theologian.
Where's his name?
Chauvin. Etienne is Stephanus in Latin, and it's a Lexicon Philosophicum. This is again a Reformed perspective. He's a professor of theology and such. And this one is another one that's also helpful, working through a variety of questions and issues. And so I always find it funny whenever there's hymns of praise at the beginning of a dictionary. It's a different age, isn't it? And so it begins working through by all the different terms that you might run into philosophically, theologically, and then sometimes you'll even have references to law and medicine in the way that things are drawn out. So what you notice in this one, which is also something that you have to be aware of in the period, notice how it says ordine alphabeticae, or alphabetico. You cannot assume that a lexicon from this period will be arranged alphabetically. In fact, that was a point of contention. Someone like Johannes Heinrich Alsted is not going to arrange his work alphabetically. He's going to arrange the work according to the topic and break it down according to the way the topic should be divided. And so he will arrange his whole encyclopedia, which is a multi-volume work, on the arrangement of topics in the order of knowledge. And the argument was that if you alphabetize something, you cut all the ties of one topic to another. So it was not a foregone conclusion in the 16th and 17th century that these reference materials should be arranged alphabetically. That was a hot topic, believe it or not. So as you're working through some of these lexicons, when we get into the modern question of how do we build tools off of these things, do you try to preserve Alsted's sensibility or not? These are the types of questions that we muddle over in developing tools that would sort of harmonize these sorts of issues. Another one, the other one that I would like to show you is the one that we've been working with in our project. And there's some of the ones that I've shown you today. By the way, this work by David Chytraeus on the study of theology, on the beginning study of theology. One of the things that you'll see in this book is that he talks about the method of interpretation of Scripture. So this is a kind of a 101 class on here's how you handle the question of Scripture, and oh, by the way, here's all these definitions you need to be familiar with. So this is all this prolegomenal sort of stuff at the level of theology. One of the most significant pieces, and the reason I think it's one of the most significant pieces that needs to be studied and attended to by theologians across the theological spectrum of whether Roman Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, or otherwise, Altensteg, is because his Vocabularius Vocum was an early textbook in 1508 that was utilized well into the 1560s and 70s by Reformed as well as Lutherans as well as Catholics. This is a textbook and reference material that originates in the late 15th century and has a lifespan of over 100 years. And so I think this is an important baseline. I think that it needs to be mentioned. The reason you go through all of this work with the Lexica and the distinctions and the definitions, is because it provides a baseline in which you're able to read other theologians and find out how big of a difference is this. Someone looks at someone and says, well, that's an odd way of saying it, to a modern, and then says, well, this person's distinctive. Well, if you're not reading it within the context of the definitions, distinctions, and conversations of the day, you might see this person as more distinctive than they are. And then you're into all of the problems of the central dogma thesis, which is you take one particular doctrine or issue, you elevate that above all other issues, and you read it back into every issue you can. That's poor method as far as a historian is concerned. So Altensteg here provides a wonderful baseline in which to work. And that's why we've developed something called LIMPED. It's admittedly a very difficult, a very sad sort of website title, LIMPED. But it stands for Lexica of Early Modern Philosophy and Theology. It's a transcription project that the Junius Institute has started, and it's relating to not only early modern philosophy and theology, but it's transconfessional. It's trying to develop the resources to mine the text and to search out these cross-references. As you've noted, whenever you work through some of these texts, they will tell you where they're reading and what they're looking at. And so what would be nice, what would be the dream, would be to have these compendia, these lexica, these distinctions books, these definition books transcribed in such a way that you can easily work among them and compare. Like a Wikipedia sort of thing, of sorts, except I'll show you what we're envisioning in the way that we're working through this. This is a crowdsourced project, which means volunteers are welcome. It has many different aspects to this project. There's the side of it if you're comfortable working and just transcribing, just writing what you see, that's perfect. If you have some background in Latin, that's perfect. If you're an established scholar who would like to get into this material, that's perfect too. We need people who can edit and these sorts of things. But to show you the piece itself, let's see. This is our site, Lexica of Early Modern Philosophy and Theology. And what you've noticed is we've got all of the headwords here out of Altensteg. What this is we've set this up in a Wikimedia platform, which allows us to not only enter the data in a pretty regular fashion, but it also allows there to be discussion on the work. I think that's important for the transcribers and the community that's interested in this text and working around it to be able to have a logged conversation. What do we do with this? How do we understand this? So now all of a sudden the tool not only fosters understanding of the period, but it also becomes a means of social interaction on a global scale. So we've got something here that's very helpful. And so what we're doing is we're setting it up to where you can view grammatical terms, philosophical terms. Right now we're just working with Altensteg. That's a significant one as it stands. So what you would do is if you were interested in editing or working with something like this, whether just to view it or to actually transcribe on it, you would click on this headword and it would pull you into this text. Now this screen is not, I've got to be able to get to the right-hand side of this screen, so I'm having a little trouble as to why. But if you look at this website, what you'll notice is you've got the transcription here. We've tried to paginate it, so there's a whole other section of the page over here. There we are. Thank you. So what you'll notice is the way we've laid this out is you've got the folio reference here, the column it's in. As you begin, you've got the headword. This is a straight transcription of the Latin. And what you'll see is we've coordinated it to where you can pull up the text. So we've modified the book reader that Internet Archive uses, and we've modified the Wikimedia platform to merge them. So what you have is an environment where you can transcribe and move through the text. Now, I want to point some things out, if I may, as a Latin instructor. One of the things that you will notice immediately is as you work through, so if you see here on the third line where you have spiritum, there's that nice little macron, which in your grammar textbooks means something about the case, something about its place in the declension. That's not what it means here. This is now we're into paleography. So as you begin to do this transcription project, you're doing a little bit of paleography. But you're also involved not only in the sources, you also get to do a little bit of coding.
Well, how did you bring that over into your text then?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. How did you bring that over into the text? Well, you can search on, we're standardizing the Latin on the left. And what's happening is, if you look at the edit page, you might just see a bunch of gobbledygook. But what you'll notice in all of this gobbledygook is you'll see here, you'll see that we've tagged it. The original has the NO with the macron over it, and then over here we have a coding that regularizes it. Puts it in a normal, ruled way, so that when the reader looks at it, they say non. Although the hiding in the text behind it is the abbreviation, which means you can search the database on either term. You can search it with the abbreviation, or you can search it on a regularized form. So the goal here is to try to bring as much reference material into it. So watch this. We have some folks that just type what they see. Then we have some folks that go back in and actually work with these terms and work on the script. Then we have some that go and proofread. They may not transcribe, they may not want to code, but they're willing to proofread what we have and say, hey, I think this is incorrect, or this is right, or we need to worry about this issue. So what that does for us, let's see. So we do have a login process. All you have to do is register. If you don't register, we do record your IP address, just to know if we're getting spammed or not. Now, as you work through this piece, what you'll also notice is, for example, you have Nicholas of Lyra over here referenced. So what we're doing is, by setting this up in a database, one of the things you can do is, as you click on this, it will pull up all of the references of Nicholas of Lyra in the text at the moment. You could do a similar thing with Jerome. So again, we've been working with maybe about 25 or 30 of these headwords to get our form right. Another one, oh, by the way, we've also coordinated it with Perseus, the Latin word study tool. So for our users, if they're working through this text and they have a question of how they should translate a particular word, they can double click on the word in the text and it will pull up the Latin word study tool. So and of course you've got the Lewis and Short dictionary right here as well. So the ability to move within the text for a transcription project, for our user audience, it provides a lot of nimble options. Another one that would be a good one to look at, to give you another example, would be the word theologia, or teologia, as some would say. And you can see you've got different ways that this is broken down. So you get the typical distinctions. Here's the references in Thomas Aquinas. You have the old discussion between Jerome and the Vetus Latina about whether or not it should be verbum or sermo. You have that little term present there. But if you clicked on Thomas Aquinas, you would again see here's some of the various head words and such that you could use. Now the beautiful part of this is, as we work through other things other than Altensteg, now all of a sudden you're able to coordinate, here's citations, here's who's being used among the Lutherans on the topic of theology, here's who's being used among the Roman Catholics on the topic of theology, here's who's being used by the Reformed. So all of a sudden, as you build this sort of project, it begins to snowball with the connections and those sorts of things. So that gives you a sense of the types of transcription projects that we are involved in. One of the works that we're doing at the Junius Institute. We are a nonprofit organization. We live on volunteers. That's the way that we've been operating for several years. We appreciate your use of all of our resources, whether Post-Reformation Digital Library, whether it's our digital companions, whether it's now LIMPED. But we also need to emphasize that we are able to prosper as on our user community. PRDL was built primarily by a user community. It started among graduate students, but it quickly moved across the world. And folks from around the world have been very gracious with their time to help grow that project. We hope to see something similar in something along these lines. If we're going to work in the theology and the philosophy of the early modern period, I think it's reasonable to think that we should work with the terms as they understood them in their own time. Now, at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions or curiosity sorts of questions, or if you've got substantive engagement sort of questions, please feel free. No questions.
It's amazing. It's just staggering the work. I can't even fathom it.
Well, it does represent quite a bit of work that's involved. One of the things that we are currently considering and looking at with the image, there's a question of, why a transcription project? Why not do Google's approach, where you take a moderately good picture and you run it through something like Abby FineReader, an optical character recognition program, OCR program, and just take the gobbledygook from that and just dump it into a text file. Why not do that approach? It is 90% accurate. Well, that's true, but 90% accurate sounds great when it's only 100 words. But when you're dealing with 1 million characters, 90% accuracy means 100,000 corrections you need to make. So the amount of time it would take to actually find those, locate them, and fix them is much more labor-intensive at this point than simple transcription. The nice thing about something like this is somebody can say, hey, this is only a paragraph. I'm interested in this topic. Hey, here's the topic on liberum arbitrium. I'm interested in that topic. I'm going to transcribe that real quick. It'll help me. It'll help others. And oh, by the way, that gets me immediately connected. If you'll notice, if I were working on this Theologia question in Altensteg, I could, if I wanted to, click on the discussion page, and I would immediately be able to log in and have a conversation about that topic with other scholars. So it's a platform for communication and study and a resource. It's a teaching tool in that you're able to teach students not only how to do the paleography, but also increasingly how to do the work in the digital field. I think we need to adjust our understanding. There is not, I'm more and more hesitant to talk about digital humanities. I think it's more important to talk about humanities that have digital tools. In 10 to 15 years, the projects that we're doing and calling them digital humanities will simply be humanities. The idea that there's a humanities over here and there's digital means by which, and that's another discipline, I think what you're going to see in the next 10 to 15 years is a collapsing of the two. So that if you're going to work in the early modern period, it's not simply a matter of knowing what's in the rare book room. It's knowing how to access, manipulate, and utilize digital tools. And in that environment, what's going to help seminaries, universities, and young programs is the ability to move between these periods. How do you do this sort of research with a user base that spans the globe? So these types of tools, I think, are going to be more and more important. So if you're interested in a line on your curriculum vitae, which deals with transcription and paleography and working in early modern period with established scholars from around the world, we would love to hear from you. You're free to email or go to our website, www.juniusinstitute.org, and that we have an information link. You can email us. You can simply say, hey, I'm interested in LIMPED. Sign me up, or what can I do? Notice you can also come over here on the page LIMPED, www.limped.org. If you go to the home page, you'll notice there is a create an account and log in. This is free. Okay, so we're happy to be a part of this. So this allows you to get into some sorts of projects. The other thing that I think this showcases is the fact that this type of layout, where you have the text, which becomes the tool to have a conversation, That's a newer way of thinking about how you engage literature. Yes, we want to publish. Yes, we want to get into publications and books and all sorts of things. But this sort of engagement online opens up the possibility of developing tools and communities. And those sorts of things then begin to develop conferences and other sorts of aspects. So there's a wonderful aspect here for scholarship, for teaching, and for development. That's a lot of answer to your question.
Well, the whole wiki idea is an idea that's, taking on, catching on in education to do exactly what you're saying. It's a powerful tool. Is there a way whereby somebody who may be reading this, say he's reading this ABBA article, and he sees an error, that he can flag that?
Yes.
Somehow.
Yes, so if someone were working through this and they wanted to flag an error, what they could do is they could come in and they could edit and log in. And what this Wikimedia thing is doing is it's actually logging who made the change, whether or not it should be verified, whether or not it should be accepted. And so it becomes now a moderated sort of engagement.
Right, and everybody can edit it.
And everybody can edit it. Okay. It does. We would love to know your name rather than just a string of numbers and periods from your IP address, but we would love to be able to so there is a process by which we have that if you're interested in this, we'd love to talk to you and find out what your specialty is and how you could help. We've got folks who are interested, who know a lot about computers, that say, hey, I can help with the coding. I might even be able to help write something that would simplify some of these things. Or we have people that say, hey, I'm really good in Latin paleography, but I'm not so comfortable with this digital stuff. How can I help? Or we have students that say, hey, I'd love to learn how to do both. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And as you can see, this becomes a great tool for the classroom. The ability to do comparative reading, the ability to engage in a variety of formats. Other questions? Well, yes?
Do you have any idea, you must have, how widely this is being used and how many people are contributing and participating and where they're from? Can you give us some?
This particular project is coming out of its alpha stage, which means that what you are seeing is not currently public yet. So we are in the process of launching this, which is in part why we want to do a presentation on the importance of these sorts of terms for the way we think about the discipline, and also here's why these sorts of tools are helpful, and how someone might be able to use it. But right now this is in its initial stages, and it's just a very limited user group, maybe 10 folks, and mostly in dealing with design and comments and questions along those lines. So if you get in on this stage of it, you can help us. If you have a design element or a question you would like to bring up, there's some aspects of that we could consider. Some of it are kind of fixed, but others of it are a little more flexible.
You gave a list of maybe 6 or 8 of those Lexica. You're probably finding more of those, or will find more of those. I mean, is this
yes.
What do you anticipate there?
I think what you do is you have to. There's a part of this is driven by the user community. One of the things I look forward to is, my specialty is primarily in Protestant studies, and so when I bump into Dominicans and Jesuits who are interested in this period of theology, and they say, hey, I noticed you've looked at this, but you haven't looked at this person. This guy's really important for us. Oh. So that sort of engagement allows us to say, okay, well, let's try to get something together to where there's this conversation that was going on in the period. Let's kind of revive that now about the tools and the terms and these sorts of things. How's that working? So this opens up the door for a lot of collaboration. And I think the other answer is you've got to be selective. One way to put it is something like Altensteg is quoted all the way into the 18th century. Somebody like Chauvin is not. He might have so you have to look judiciously at the lifespan of these reference works. Some of them are used longer. you've got editions of Altensteg that starts in the early 1500s and goes into the early 1600s. That's a significant period of time. It's as Protestant Reformed Orthodoxy is developing in its confessional environment, and these terms and ideas are still in use and still in development. By the time you get to the 19th century, a lot of these terms are being said that they need to be chucked. We need to get rid of them. We need to excise them. We need to avoid them. We need to be anti-metaphysical. Those are some of the impulses that are moving in theology. And so what you're seeing now in the 21st century is, wait a second. We've got this aspect of the history we need to recover. So I think the periodization is an important question. That will help guide us in which lexica are the most important. And also, as this user community develops from different traditions and different specialties, that will also guide us. This particular lexica is used very widely. This one is not. I think that's a helpful one. Some of these are very short. So, for example, the one by David Chatreus, that one, I think the definitiones is only a matter of 20 pages. Okay, the point of showing that one is that this is a prolegomenal little work, and everybody's doing definitio, everybody's doing distinctio, everybody's doing something. But Altensteg represents a huge lexica. And so I'm not familiar with it enough to know what counts as a distinctio book, or distinctiones book, what counts as a lexica yet. My sense is size. But then you have somebody like Alsted, who his encyclopedia is multi-volume, but his definitio book is relatively thin. His distinctio book is relatively thin. So there is a conversation that we need to have as we develop these. Right now, Altensteg is kind of transconfessional. After that, we have certainly options with someone like Etienne Chauvin or someone like Alsted, or Maccovius is already in print, so there's may or may not be a need for that one. All sorts of options. It's a good question, though. Be a part of the discussion, and let's talk. Yes, sir.
You have Altensteg as the main piece right now, and you're talking about adding other pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way, and if so, how would it work to be able to
Coordinate
those to where you could, if you were just interested in looking at what Altensteg has, you could pare it down to that, or you could have it to where it's collective with a number of different.
I think the best way to answer that would be to show you something like this. So if you had like a head word, a very common head word, again, folks are not going to, and that would be another editorial work, wouldn't it? To be able to go in and say, here's how some of these coordinate. You know, these people are using this set of terms, and it seems to be interacting with this set of terms. So now this reference tool becomes a means by which you examine differences in terms. But in places where they agree, imagine a situation where everybody's going to define theologia.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you click on it, not only would you pull up Altensteg, but imagine scrolling down farther, and now all of a sudden you're dealing with, okay, varieties of issues and instances, and here's other writers. So you have the comparative text. Or imagine if in another instance you're looking at theologia and you see somebody like Thomas Aquinas is cited. Well, then you could do a search on where is Thomas Aquinas cited in other definitions of theologia. So now you're able to coordinate and look at confessional distinctions. You're able to look at time frame differences. Hey, here's a Catholic text in the 16th century. Look how many times they're citing Gerson. Look how many times they're citing Nicholas of Lyra. Here's a Catholic lexicon from the 18th century. They seem to be citing other people. So you get a change in the authorities. I think that's a fascinating study right there. When you start talking about the development of doctrine and the changing of terms and philosophies, you're talking about the changes in authorities. Who's referenced, who's used, who's considered helpful, who's not. Those are the types of things that a historian would be interested in, and a tool like this from the text would be very helpful. But again, you've got to build it. So, yeah, that's a great point, though. Yes, sir?
What you pointed out about the 19th century concerning the expunging of these terms from philosophical and theological discussion seems to be pretty obvious, but when you're dealing with people who are advocating getting rid of these Latin terms in the name of pure Calvinism, how do they not see that they're just going along with Hegel and all those guys?
I can't speak to how they don't see something. I could speak to the fact that I think there's a suspicion. I think that the terms are tied to a particular philosophy, and one of the points to make is that you have terms that are debated in this period. I think that's the point of the whole project. Is these terms and these different lexica are debated along confessional lines. Some of them are not, and I think that would surprise folks. Sometimes you'll have lexica cited by Reformed, Lutheran, or otherwise. They'll cite Dominicans, they'll cite Jesuits, sometime approvingly, sometime and say this is not they'll say this is not an issue. We agree with the logicians. He's a Jesuit, he's a logician, he's Spanish. We agree with him on this point of how you divide the topic. We disagree on what you actually mean by it. So you see all sorts of interactions that are not necessarily as clean as saying, well, they're Catholic, we don't listen to them. Or they're Protestant, we don't listen to them. Right. So there's a sense in which I think the recovery project of just understanding the relationships, you may want to debate about what liberum arbitrium means, but you still have the term. Yeah. That was my point of bringing up the gentleman who wants to, the systematic theologian who wants to excise Thomism from Reformed thought, and yet at the same time he's using phrases like fundamentum and re. How did you make the distinction of what you can keep and what you can't if you're not going to do it on traditional grounds? I think that's a helpful kind of conversation to have. So it's a methodological one, and it's a historical one as well. Thanks for the question, though. Well, not seeing anyone seeking the floor. I got another question. Okay, yes, sir.
How do we volunteer? What kind of commitment does this involve? Is this so many hours a week, or when we can get in?
It is a labor of love. So you've got to determine how much love you have for this project, and rule your priorities likewise.
Okay.
We'll be sending out more information through our website, and if people who sign up, we will send out an email. The first step is to find out who's interested. The second step is to coordinate those efforts, and then we'll get into the actual project. The great part of this is because it's divided by head words, you could have some person that says, hey, I really want to work on actus. Hey, I really want to work on actio. Hey, I really want to work on accidens. And if you look, for example, I'll show you. So like something like accidens, okay, that's a stub. We haven't transcribed it yet. You click on the little book there, and what you'll see is here's the section. That's it, right there. It starts up there with the quad pollis. Let's see. I'll zoom in for you. It starts up here. So it starts up there, and you've got all sorts of citations being given, and then it ends down here, right there at acutus. So the answer is, how much of a commitment does it take? Well, depending on what you want to do and how much time you want to spend on a particular headword, that could be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that could be maybe 20. It just depends on how much you want to invest in it. And what this kind of moderated forum does is it's the project of an ant. Everybody's going to lift a little, and all of a sudden, if everyone does something, it will move towards its completion. So it's a great way to set up a project. And you can see how we've done it here. So if you work through. Now, on the other hand, I'll show you one that would be a lot more complex. Just as a hunch. So this one has 10 different sub-definitions. And again, it's a stub, but if you said, okay, I'm only going to work on the first one, you see you've got the first definition here, ratio secundum according to the Scotists. ratio according to someone else. Here's it is in Thomas. I think that's helpful. It's trying to do this project, but now not just in relation to Thomas. It's doing this project in relation to someone like Scotus or Gerson or Ailes. So it just depends. Again, you can see in this particular Lexica, this one's a short entry. So again, it's getting oriented and sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to do this much today. Some of these are longer definitions than others. And the wonderful thing is because it's a communal project, you can type in and say, okay, here's my point, I've got a question, I'm running into this on this particular topic, and your note is tied to that particular definition. So it gives you the opportunity to ask a question to the community, and then we can respond as we have ability and those sorts of things. So it's a nice way to build a tool. Well, I look forward to seeing you again, and we've got more of these events. Please check out our blog, Junius Institute. The name of our blog is Opuscula Selecta. And you can find out the dates of our next events that will be online as well as in person. Our next event will occur at Calvin Seminary in October. You can see the website for details. If you would like to sign up for our mailing list, or if you would like to volunteer for any of our projects, please sign up online. If you represent an institute or a school of theology or a college that would love to see some workshops that centered on these types of topics that would help your students, we would love to be a part of that. And you can contact us as well with those types of questions and proposals. The wonderful thing about the virtual world is you can do things over distance that were previously unthinkable. But if it is possible to come and spend some time with you in person, that'd be great too. We look forward to seeing you in October, and thanks for being here today. Have a good afternoon.